Hi, my name is Lisa Heck, and this is my recap of my interview with an instructional designer for EAC 580. In my interview, there were four things that I was really interested in learning more about. The first thing that I really wanted to focus on was learner analyses and how often they were actually utilized in the instructional design process. I also wanted to learn more about instructional design theories and how they work in real life instructional design versus what we learn about in class. I wanted to learn more about some of the challenges of working with subject matter experts, and I wanted to learn more about how instructional design has changed over time, especially in a K-12 environment. My interviewee name is Brigham Kelly. I actually got his contact information from a friend of mine that I used to teach with. She now works for Franklin Covey, and he's an instructional designer on her team. So even though he's an instructional designer, his actual job name is technical product manager. And he actually said that he's never been called an instructional designer for any of his jobs in his life, but that's what he's done since he's graduated from college. And he works with Franklin Covey, which is a unique company that creates training programs for students of all ages. So K-12 students all the way even through higher education, so college-age students as well. And their training programs focus on social developmental skills for students regardless of their age. Brigham actually began his career after graduating from Brigham Young University in 2002. Right after he graduated, he moved straight to China, where he decided that he was going to teach English to adult learners. So his degree was a degree in English, which is why this was a good fit for him, but he never really saw himself being a teacher long term or anything like that. This was just a chance for him to kind of think about what it was that he wanted to do with his degree. When he got to China, he taught these learners for a couple years, and during that process, he started to become a lot more engaged and curious about adult learners and how they learn and how to motivate them to want to learn. During this time, he also started to change some of the curriculum for the programs that he taught to create materials that were more engaging for his adult learners and to create curriculum material that could be utilized by multiple different teachers, regardless of what school they were teaching English in China. So he ended up staying in China for a total of 6 years before he moved back to the United States, where he started designing curriculum for students in Middlebury College in Middlebury, Connecticut. And he actually worked for the Interactive Languages Department, and he created instructional design programs to teach these students how to learn Mandarin. During that time, he also started creating instructional programs to teach younger students how to learn Mandarin, and this is what got him interested in his next career venture, which was working for ABC Mouse to create app-based instruction for young English learners in China. So at this point, Brigham had been focused on teaching and understanding the learning of adult learners, that he now wanted to see what the difference was in teaching and understanding the learning for younger students so that he could see how their motivation for learning changed over time. When it comes to instructional design models, it sounds like the use of these models in real life doesn't necessarily always flow the way that we learn about them in class. Brigham says that he's not a fan of ADDIE or SAM or any other specific instructional model, but instead he says the most important thing to focus on is not the model or the process of creating instructional design, but to focus on learning what it is that the target audience needs to learn, what the client wants, and creating instruction that's developed specifically for them based on those needs. So even though Brigham doesn't necessarily follow a model specifically, he does tend to loosely follow the ADDIE model in terms of developing or analyzing his learners first, developing and designing material, and then implementing and evaluating that material after it's been created. So when it comes to the first steps of his design process, he always starts with a learner analysis, and typically he does that through the use of direct observation and interviews with learners to get more information about what it is that they're lacking in, what they need, additional training for. And he also says that he spends a lot of time trying to make his own conclusions because it's very difficult for him to get specific information about these learners from his client. So by getting learner stories and directly observing the students, he's able to get the most information about what it is that they need. He also said that the main challenges with these learner and needs analyses are cost and time. It takes a lot of time to do a thorough needs analysis and learner analysis, task analysis. And if you want more information, it, costs more money to do that. So that's why he tends to focus specifically on just observing and listening to learner stories. Once he's completed his analysis of the learner, he then moves on to developing his own instructional model. Now, a lot of times this is where the subject matter expert comes into play. And in his experience, he says the best thing to do is to create the instructional model, create an outline of what it is that he wants to do for his training programs that he's developing. And then whatever blanks he still has, he goes back and asks the subject matter expert for his opinion on that information. So this helps to kind of narrow down exactly what it is that he needs from the subject matter expert without involving the SME throughout the entire process, because in his experience, he says that by involving them in the entire process, typically things start to get a little bit out of hand and kind of go off on more of a tangent than he would like for it to happen. So it's just faster, more efficient for him to specifically ask the SME for information that he is still lacking before he moves on to designing his instruction. Once he's ready to design the instruction, he says that he uses an iterative approach. So he's constantly designing, tweaking, implementing, and then going back and tweaking some more, implementing some more to see what those tweaks have done, fixing some things, implementing again, so on and so forth. He says it's very rare to create an instructional design program that works right the first time. So by going back, by implementing the programs actually and using formative evaluation and then going back and making changes to those programs, that's how he ends up creating instructional materials that are usable for a longer period of time. He also says that it's important to take into consideration the use of technology. So currently in his role as a technical product manager at Franklin Covey, he creates two different types of programs. He creates self-paced programs where he uses learning management systems to help with the flow of the material in that particular process. And he also creates instructor-led courses. And he says that it's much easier, obviously, for him to create self-paced learning experiences because the students are able to complete these programs through these learning management systems relatively easily. When it comes to instructor-led courses, it's a little bit more difficult for him to create those or implement those, I guess you could say, because it all depends on how well versed the instructor is in being able to utilize multiple different types of technology so that the students are able to get the most out of this program. He has created app-based instruction in the past, and he really enjoyed doing that, especially since younger students tend to like to use these app-based programs. Mainly, he was creating games to teach younger children how to speak English in China. He's also created Flash, like Flash videos and things like that for his learning management systems for these self-paced or even instructor-led courses. And sometimes he's had to create more HTML-based like programs as well so that they can be utilized in more situations. Sometimes Flash Player can be difficult because not all students or schools have access to Flash Player, especially if they're using devices like Chromebooks and things like that, where they don't necessarily have all of the plugins that are required for that. When it comes to implementing instructional design, this is where everything leaves Brigham's hands. I know that this can be a little bit different depending on what type of instructional design is being created. A lot of times when it comes to education, instructional designers will create the instruction and then implement it themselves. Whereas in like bigger corporations and things like that outside of education, a lot of the times there are trainers that are specifically hired to implement the instructional design. So it's unique for Brigham because in the past, with his curriculum that he's created, especially when he was working in China, he was also the one that was responsible for implementing that curriculum. So it was very easy for him to constantly, basically for him, iterate, tweak, iterate again, tweak, so on and so forth until he made the program perfect. This is why formative assessment is so important for him, because he's able to see formative evaluation. I'm sorry, not formative assessment. Formative evaluation is important for him because he's able to kind of get a better idea of how the program would be implemented in real life, just to make sure that all of the changes that are necessary to be made are made prior to it being implemented for real. So being the designer but not the implementer definitely has its pros and cons for him. It takes a lot longer now for him to get a better idea of how the program is going and what changes need to be made once it's implemented in real life. It can definitely take time to get those results back, but he believes that it's very important to use evaluation results to make instruction better. And if you're doing the instructional design process correctly, instructional design never ends because you're constantly finding things that can be done better, especially as things like technology improve or learners change. So when it comes to formative and summative evaluation for instructional design, I've already kind of touched on this a little bit, but I've learned that both types of evaluation are very important when it comes to creating successful instructional design programs. Formative assessment is really important to create a training program that's useful for the learners. And then summative evaluation is really important to make sure that the program continues to be useful for your target audience. Some of the challenges and rewards that Brigham focused on for his instructional design career right now were focused mainly around the subject matter experts and the learners themselves. So the challenges obviously focused a little bit more around working with subject matter experts. He believed it's definitely harder to work with them because a lot of the times their wants and needs don't necessarily align with what's realistic, and it's difficult to kind of get them to understand that. Sometimes it can also be difficult to design instruction for broad age ranges. So since he's teaching or creating instructional material to teach high school students and higher ed students, that's a little bit easier for him, but it's a lot more difficult if he's trying to create a program that could be implemented in a K-12 school. So, trying to create different versions of things so that they can appeal to learners of all ages is challenging. It's also challenging for him to find the best ways to keep learners engaged and motivated, but for him, he thinks that's actually one of the most fun parts of the design process and why he focuses so much on the learner and learner stories in the beginning. When it comes to rewards, the two main things that he really, really enjoys about his career are seeing the program that he's created being successfully implemented in a classroom and actually making or helping students make changes, positive changes in their education. He also really likes to see learner growth, not necessarily just in their skills, but in their self-confidence as well, because he believes by focusing on the self-confidence of the learners, their skills will improve as a result of that. So some of the final thoughts from my interview were mainly that the instructional design process is very detailed and involved, and it's very important to focus on the learner needs and focus on what it is that the client wants to make sure that the learners are getting the training that they need to be successful. Theories aren't always reality. You have to be flexible as an instructional designer because a lot of the times the things that you initially think are going to work might not always be the best choice. It's also important to be conscious of the type of subject matter expert that you're working with and use that information to help make the design process run as smoothly as possible. By getting everything set up for the SME in the beginning, creating your instructional model, creating your outline, and then asking the SME for help, it seems like it helps to streamline the process and make it more efficient for the instructional designer. I also learned that it's important to observe others in the instructional design field and be adaptable because the field is constantly evolving. This was a really fun project for me, and I learned a lot about instructional design and what it's like to be an instructional designer in real life.